Hi guys, next installment in Wonder. I'm up to page 15. The chapter's called Paging Mr. Tushman. If you're reading along, good job. I would have been more nervous about meeting Mr. Tushman if I'd have known I was also going to be meeting some kids from the new school. But I didn't know, so if anything, I was kind of giggly. I couldn't stop thinking about all the jokes Daddy had made about Mr. Tushman's name. So when me and Mum arrived at Beecher Prep a few weeks before the start of school, I saw Mr. Tushman standing there, waiting for us at the entrance. I started giggling straight away. He didn't look at all like what I pictured though. I guess I thought he would have a huge butt, but he didn't. In fact, he was a pretty normal guy, tall and thin, old but not really old. He seemed nice. He shook my mum's hand first. "Hi, Mr. Tushman. It's so nice to see you again," Mum said. "This is my son, August." Mr. Tushman looked right at me and smiled and nodded. He put his hand out for me to shake. "Hi, August," he said, totally normally. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Hi," I mumbled, dropping my hand into his hand while looking down at his feet. He was wearing red Adidas trainers. "So," he said, kneeling down in front of me so I couldn't look at his trainers, but I had to look at his face. "Your mum and dad have told me a lot about you." "Like, what have they told you?" I asked. "Sorry?" "Honey, you have to speak up," said Mum. "Like what?" I asked, trying not to mumble. I admit I have a bad habit of mumbling. "Well, they said that you like to read," said Mr. Tushman, "and that you're a great artist. You have blue eyes with white eyelashes. And you're into science, right?" "Uh-huh," I said, nodding. "We've got a couple of great science electives at Beecher," he said. "Maybe you'll take one of them." "Uh-huh," I said, though I had no idea what an elective was. "So are you ready to take a tour?" "You mean we're doing that now?" I said. "Did you think we were going to the movies?" he answered, smiling as he stood up. "You didn't tell me we were taking a tour," I said to Mum in my accusing voice. "Augie," she started to say. "It'll be fine, August," said Mr. Tushman, holding his hand out to me. "I promise." I think he wanted me to take his hand, but I took Mum's instead. He smiled and started walking towards the entrance. Mummy gave my hand a little squeeze, though I don't know if it was an "I love you" squeeze or an "I'm sorry" squeeze. Probably a little bit of both. The only school I'd ever been inside before was Via's. When I went with Mum and Dad to watch Via sing in spring concerts and stuff like that, this school was very different. It was smaller and it smelled a bit like a hospital. Next chapter. Nice Mrs. Garcia. We followed Mr. Tushman down a few hallways. There weren't a lot of people around, and a few people who were there didn't seem to notice me at all, though that might have been because they didn't see me. I sort of hid behind Mum as I walked. I know that sounds kind of babyish of me, but I wasn't feeling very brave right then. We ended up in a small room with the words "Office of the Middle School Director" on the door. Inside there was a desk with a nice-seeming lady sitting behind it. "This is Mrs. Garcia," said Mr. Tushman, and the lady smiled at Mum and took off her glasses and got up out of her chair. My mother shook her hand and said, "Isabel Pullman, nice to meet you." "And this is August," Mr. Tushman said. Mum kind of stepped to the side a bit so I would move forward. Then that thing happened that I've seen a million times before. When I looked up at her, Mrs. Garcia's eyes dropped for a second. It was so fast no one else would have noticed, since the rest of her face stayed exactly the same. She was smiling a really shiny smile. "Such a pleasure to meet you, August," she said, holding out her hand for me to shake. "Hi," I said quietly, giving her my hand, but I didn't want to look at her face, so I kept staring at her glasses, which hung from a chain around her neck. "Wow, what a firm grip," said Mrs. Garcia. Her hand was really warm. "The kid's got a killer handshake," Mr. Tushman agreed, and everyone laughed above my head. "You can call me Mrs. G," said Mrs. Garcia. I think she was talking to me, but I was looking at all the stuff on her desk now. "That's what everyone calls me, Mrs. G. I forgot my combination. Mrs. G, I forgot my combination. Mrs. G, I need a late pass. Mrs. G, I want to change my elective." "Mrs. G's actually the one who runs the place," said Mrs. Tushman, which again made all the grown-ups laugh. "I'm here every morning by 7:30, Mrs. Garcia continued, still looking at me, while I stared at her brown sandals with small purple flowers on the buckles. So if you ever need anything, August, I'm the one to ask. You can ask me anything. Okay, I mumbled. Oh, look at that cute baby, Mum said, pointing to one of the photographs on Mrs. Garcia's bulletin board. Is he yours? Oh, no, my goodness, said Mrs. Garcia, smiling a big smile now that was totally different from her shiny smile. You've just made my day. He's my grandson. Oh, what a cutie, said Mum, shaking her head. How old? That picture was at 5 months, I think, but he's big now, almost 8 years old. Wow, said Mum, nodding and smiling. Well, he is absolutely beautiful. Thank you, said Mrs. Garcia, nodding like she was about to say something else about her grandson. But then all of a sudden, her smile got a bit smaller. We're all going to take very good care of August, she said to Mum, and I saw her give Mum's hand a little squeeze. I looked at Mum's face, and that's when I realised that she was just as nervous as I was. I guess I liked Mrs. Garcia when she wasn't wearing her shiny smile. What do you think a shiny smile means, guys? Why was she doing her shiny smile when she saw August for the first time? Next chapter. Can't read it backwards, hold on. Jack, Will, Julian, and Charlotte. Jack Will is one person. He just has two names. Jack Will, Julian, and Charlotte. So 3 people. We followed Mr. Tushman into a small room across from Mrs. Garcia's desk. He was talking as he closed the door to his office and sat down behind his big desk, though I wasn't really paying much attention to what he was saying. I was looking around at all the things on his desk. Cool stuff like a globe that floated in the air and a Rubik's type cube made with little mirrors. I liked his office a lot. I liked that there were all these neat little drawings and paintings by students on the walls, framed like they were really important. Mum sat down in a chair in front of Mr. Tushman's desk, and even though there was another chair right next to hers, I decided to stand next to her. Why do you have your own room and Mrs. G doesn't? I said. You mean, why do I have an office? Asked Mr. Tushman. You said she runs the place, I said. Oh, well, I was kind of kidding. Mrs. G is my assistant. Mr. Tushman is the director of the middle school, Mum explained. Do they call you Mr. T? I asked, which made him smile. Do you know who Mr. T is? He answered. I pity the fool, he said in a funny, tough voice, like he was imitating someone. I had no idea what he was talking about. Anyway, no, said Mr. Tushman, shaking his head. No one calls me Mr. T, although I have a feeling I'm called a lot of other things I don't know about. Let's face it, a name like mine is not so easy to live with, you know what I mean? Here, I have to admit I totally laughed because I knew exactly what he meant. My mum and dad used to have a teacher called Miss Butt, I said. Oi, said Mum, but Mr. Tushman laughed. Now that's bad, said Mr. Tushman, shaking his head. I guess I shouldn't complain. Hey, so listen, August. Here's what I thought we would do today. Is that a pumpkin? I said, pointing to a framed painting behind Mr. Tushman's desk. Augie, sweetie, don't interrupt, said Mum. You like it? Said Mr. Tushman, turning around and looking at the painting. I do too, and I thought it was a pumpkin too, until the student who gave it to me explained that it's actually not a pumpkin. Are you ready for this? It's a portrait of me. Now, August, I ask you, do I really look that much like a pumpkin? No, I answered, though I was thinking yes. Something about the way his cheeks puffed out when he smiled made him look like a jack-o'-lantern. Just as I thought that, it occurred to me how funny that was. Cheeks, Mr. Tushman, and I started laughing a little. I shook my head and covered my mouth with my hand. Mr. Tushman smiled like he could read my mind. I was about to say something else, but then all of a sudden I heard other voices outside the office. Kids' voices. I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but my heart literally started beating like I'd just run the longest race in the world. The laughter I had inside just poured out of me. The thing is, when I was little, I never minded meeting new kids because all the kids I met were really little too. What's cool about really little kids is they don't say stuff to try and hurt your feelings, even though sometimes they do say stuff that hurts your feelings, but they don't actually know what they're saying. Big kids, though, they know what they're saying, and that is definitely not fun for me. One of the reasons I grew my hair long last year is that I like how my bangs, my fringe, covers my eyes, and it helps me block out the things I don't want to see. Mrs. Garcia knocked on the door and poked her head inside. They're here, Mr. Tushman, she said. Who's here? I said. Thanks, said Mr. Tushman to Miss Garcia. August, I thought it would be a good idea for you to meet some students who will be in your homeroom this year. That's like his class. I figure they could take you around the school a bit and show you the lay of the land, so to speak. I don't want to meet anyone, I said to Mum. Mr. Tushman was suddenly right in front of me, his hands on my shoulders. He leaned down and said very softly in my ear, It'll be okay, August. These kids are nice kids, I promise. You're going to be okay, Augie, Mum whispered with all her might. Before she could say anything else, Mr. Tushman opened the door to his office. Come on in, kids, he said, and walked 2 boys and a girl. None of them looked over at me or Mum. They stood at the door looking straight at Mr. Tushman like their lives depended on it. Thanks so much for coming, guys, especially since school doesn't start until next month, said Mr. Tushman. Have you all had a good summer? All of them nodded, but no one said anything. Great, said Mr. Tushman. So, guys, I wanted you to meet August, who's going to be the new student here this year. August, these guys have been students at Beecher Prep since kindergarten, although, of course, they were in the lower school building, but they know all the ins and outs of the middle school programme. And since you're all going to be in the same homeroom, I thought it would be nice if you all got to know each other a little before school started. Okay? So, kids, this is August. August, this is Jack Will. Jack Will looked at me and put out his hand. When I shook it, he kind of half smiled and said, hey, and looked down really fast. This is Julian, said Mr. Tushman. Hey, said Julian, and he did the exact same thing as Jack Will. He took my hand, forced a smile, and looked down fast. And Charlotte, said Mr. Tushman. Charlotte had the blondest hair I've ever seen. She didn't shake my hand, but she gave me a quick little wave and smiled. Hi, August, nice to meet you, she said. Hi, I said, looking down. She was wearing bright green Crocs. So, said Mr. Tushman, putting his hands together in a kind of slow clap. What I thought you guys could do is take August on a little tour of the school. Maybe you could start on the 3rd floor. This is where your home class is going to be. Room 301, I think. Mrs. G is room 301, Mrs. Garcia called out from the other room. Room 301, Mr. Tushman nodded. And then you can show August the science labs and the computer room, and then work your way down to the library and the performance space on the 2nd floor. Take him to the cafeteria, of course. Should we take him to the music room? Asked Julian. Oh, good idea, yeah, said Mr. Tushman. August, do you play any instruments? No, I said. It wasn't my favourite subject on account of the fact I don't really have any ears. Well, I do, but they don't exactly look like normal ears. Well, you may enjoy seeing the music room anyway, said Mr. Tushman. We have a very nice selection of percussion instruments. August, you've been wanting to learn to play the drums, said Mum, trying to get me to look at her. But my eyes were covered by my bangs, and I stared at a piece of old gum that was stuck to the bottom of Mr. Tushman's desk. Great, okay, so why don't you guys get going, said Mr. Tushman. Just be back here in, he looked at Mum. Half an hour, is that okay? I think Mum nodded. Is that okay with you, August? He asked me. I didn't answer. Is that okay, August? Mum repeated. I looked at her now. I wanted her to see just how mad at her I was. But then I saw her face and just nodded. She seemed more scared than I was. The other kids had started out of the door, so I followed them. See you soon, said Mum, her voice sounding a little higher than normal. I didn't answer her. I'm going to stop there for now, guys. I hope you're all enjoying. Let me know if you're reading along on the Padlet. It's such a good book. It's a really, really thick one, but we've got loads of time at the minute, so I'll read some more tomorrow.